Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel for my Fundamentals of Speech class. Today we're going to be doing my informative speech, and I'm going to be talking about Alright, what I was talking about before we heard that noise was my informative speech. We're going to be discussing Formula One racing, and the sound you just heard was a Formula One race car driving by. Not a lot of people know about Formula One here in the States. The more popular sport would be NASCAR, but worldwide the most popular would be considered Formula One. The term Formula One actually is talking about a list of rules that the teams and the drivers and the cars have to follow in order to be qualified to compete in the race at this event. The Formula One's Drivers' Championship was discussed in the late 1930s, but the ideas were shelved on the onset of World War II and World War I. And then in 1946, the ideas rekindled, and the season's first races were held. It wasn't an easy beginning for Formula One. Drivers were hard to find, and teams were hard to come across for competitive teams. And the only team that has ever been in Formula One, ever since the very beginning of it, was Ferrari. And Ferrari has been around ever since the beginning in 1946 to the present day today. After Ferrari started Formula One in 1946 with their drivers, an era of British dominance was ushered in when a driver by the name of Mike Hawthorn won the championship in 1958. After Hawthorn won this race, it ushered in an era where British drivers and Commonwealth drivers from British territories dominated the sport, and a company called Lotus came on the scene in the mid-1960s and 1970s, and Lotus revolutionized the way that the cars were made, the way they were presented, and that's where the iconic British racing green came from, that deep green, and that just began the dominance in the early 1970s and actually just ushered out private entries due to the rising cost of races and things like that. In 1978, Lotus had some more technological advances and was just continuing to leave everybody else in the dust. But at the end of the year, it was marked by tragedy when one of the teammates, Ronnie Peterson, was killed at Monza Raceway, and that was the beginning of the end for the Lotus era. In 1979, FISA was established, and it actually really ended up hurting the sport because them and FOCA really started to argue over rules and regulations that are included in what should be established in a race and things that people should have to follow. And this argument led to stalemates and drivers pulling out of races, and it was not good for the sport. And in 1981, the two sides reached kind of a tentative agreement called the Concord Agreement. From then on, turbo cars dominated the race because they first appeared in 1977, and then from then on, they dominated the way the sport was done. And the era of turbo cars was dominated by one driver. And I have a picture of him here. His name was Ayrton Senna, and he was widely regarded as the best driver of all time. He was born on March 21st of 1960 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he grew up racing go-karts and things like that. And that was the way he broke onto the scene of Formula 3, Formula 2, and then eventually breaking into Formula 1. He joined the small club of Thomann, which was a no-name team that nobody had ever finished on a podium for and gotten a point, and Senna took them from 16th place start to a 3rd place finish where they got their team's first ever point. It was at that point where Senna really broke onto the scene and was regarded as one of the best drivers in the world at that time. He was then signed by Lotus, and he won his first Grand Prix at Portugal, and it was his 16th Grand Prix that he raced in, and that's when he got his first win. He was really Senna's professionalism and his driver ability really stood out when it started to rain on the track. Nobody could compete with this guy when the rain started to come down, and he just dominated the field during that time. In 1988, Honda decided to come back into the sport and gave their engine to the McLaren Motorsports team around the same time that Senna was joining them. So that's when he teamed up with Alain Prost and started the biggest rivalry in Formula One history. The Brazilian driver and the French driver developed an all-out battle And it wasn't until 1994 when Prost had already retired and Senna was racing for Williams, where he ran into Timbrello Curve and was tragically killed. It was at this moment where Formula One changed forever, and Professor Sid Watkins, the Grand Prix doctor that worked on him, made the sport safer, and nobody had ever died in Formula One since. So Formula One has always been dominated by what we call the Big Four: McLaren, Williams, Renault, and Ferrari. And Ferrari's time came in the 1980s and the 1990s when Michael Schumacher and Ferrari won 15 straight titles. And that streak actually kind of hurt the sport, and people began to believe that the sport was more political than actual skill. And people started thinking that people were buying wins and things like that. So upon Schumacher's retirement in 2006, it actually coincided with the restart of competitiveness in the sport, and was actually the ultimate takeoff point from there on out.